This is part 14, Outsourcing Your Self-Interest. So in this part, we're going to look at the idea of self-interest on the largest scale of government and the smallest scale of your own person, right? And how many of us can unwittingly outsource our self-interest to others, right? Whether they be politicians or experts or some sort of decision maker, CEOs, etc., bankers, what have you, right? We unwittingly outsource our self-interests every day, and so this is an exploration of that, and it's something worth thinking about, because to think about our own decision-making process, like we discussed in the last part, in order to think about our own decision-making process, we also have to take responsibility for our choices and think about what it means when we ask others, or we expect, or even take for granted the fact that others are making choices for us, making choices on our behalf. Okay? Because after all, we don't have time to read every contract or law which directly affects our lives. And yet there's so many things every day that affect our lives directly that we really don't have the time or desire to interact with. It would be exhausting and nearly impossible anyway, right? So that's why we elect politicians and we hire lawyers to do this kind of work with the expectation that they are watching out for us, right? The big food industry doesn't inhabit the bodies of its sick customers, right? Nor does Big Pharma suffer the accidental drug deaths of over 20,000 people a year, right? And yet, both industries have built billion-dollar empires on the backs of millions of sick people who eagerly outsource their self-interests to someone else, okay? When you are ill, nothing else matters but getting well again, right? Many will defer to so-called experts and pay just about any price in order to keep themselves alive with hopes of feeling better, right? That just makes sense. The expectation that someone else, like government, is supposed to protect you and keep you safe is like expecting every representative in Congress to possess Vulcan mind meld powers, right? Possessing the ability to truly feel your pain. And of course, here's Bill Clinton one more time. I feel your pain. You know, Bill Clinton feels your pain, right? That's a science fiction statement there from Bill Clinton. He watched too many episodes of Star Trek where Mr. Spock is doing the Vulcan mind melt and he can feel your pain, right? So the point here is there are some things that we need to outsource to others, right? That we can't do ourselves, and that's okay. That's fine. But when it comes to your own personal health, for example, if you're not doing your research, if you are not really a health nut, right, then you're essentially, because that's one of the most important things you have, right, is making informed choices about what you're putting inside of your body, right? Because you don't want to be sick, obviously. I just have to say there's too many people that are outsourcing their own self-interest in when it comes to health, right? When it comes to medicine, people will have a lousy diet, then they get sick and they go to the doctor, and the doctor's supposed to fix something, right? Well, that's if you that kind of mindset put you in a trap of giving up your self-interest to others, right? It's you're the one that feels the effects of your own body, right? So nobody can care for your body like you. No one is going to give you a pill that's going to just fix that, right? Having said that, of course, there are plenty of times when we need to see a doctor. I'm not saying don't take medications if you need them. Don't see a doctor, obviously. There are times for that, but at the same time, there are so many ways that we can outsource our self-interest to others. But those people we outsource to, they don't feel the effects that we have to deal with if we outsource, right? So let's look at another example. The intentions of the American idea, right, came about from the notion that man should chart his own destiny, which is to say, the union of the original 13 colonies was formed in order to throw off the chains of oppression from the Crown of England. The colonies were taking charge of their own self-interest, right? By rejecting the rule of the Crown in England, they were no longer outsourcing their self-interest. They were taking direct control of their destiny and their self-interest. Such an action benefited all inhabitants of the colonies, not just its most powerful families and the political leadership at the time. Okay? Just like most things which have their beginnings rooted in good intentions, there would invariably arrive others looking at securing control for themselves and their business partners, right? Just as the sorcerer is born or finds that which the Magi recognizes to be for the good of everyone, right? Such is the progression of man's ideas and that which he toils to build in the name of freedom. So if you think back to the Lord of the Rings is a great analogy. Saruman, the white, and Gandalf the gray, right? Saruman starts off as a magi, right? And he moves away from this and he becomes a sorcerer later on, right? All things that start, that people in general see as beneficial and good and something they want to be a part of, those things start typically, they start with this magi energy. They start in earnest. They start with goodness, right? And then others come along later and see, how can I use this for my own purposes? Just my own, right? No kind of collective self-interest, but my own self-interest, right? And then how can I make people outsource their self-interest to serve my own self-interests, right? It happens every day in our society. Ironically, the greatest vulnerability of America is simultaneously its greatest strength, which is the idea of freedom in general, and specifically freedom of religion. That is to say, if all aspects of a society are not clearly defined under a unified authority from which all of its members can refer to, such as the case with religious nation states and the Stela of Hammurabi, then certain key parts of a society will invariably be open to interpretation and outside influence. Okay? Certain parts of a society may fall into the hands of a few opportunists seeking to control these lesser or undefined aspects of a society, right? The presumption that freedom from religion or freedom in general represented the ideal in many ways remains true and benefits Western society. However, such areas of freedom, if not explicitly bound to a constitution, a code of laws, some religious writings, etc., okay, if they're not specifically spelled out and bound, then they can often be co-opted and taken control of by the highest bidder. And I'll give you some examples, okay? And of course, after all, a chain is only as strong as its weakest links. So we'll talk about some of these weakest links now in respect to American society. Two such areas we'll explore are the areas of finance and education in America. The U.S. Constitution has surprisingly little to say about money and has absolutely nothing at all to say about education. These two areas were co-opted by globalists a century ago and remain America's greatest vulnerabilities. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says, Congress to coin money and regulate its value. And Section 10 says it denies states the rights to coin or print their own money. Okay, that's all it says about money. Just two sentences, essentially. So to coin money, by the way, means a piece of metal stamped and issued by the authority of the government for use as money. Okay. The U.S. Department of Treasury was formed in 1789 to coin the nation's money. It wasn't until 1913 that the Federal Reserve Bank was established as a private bank which finances the U.S. government with fiat currency. It's the Federal Reserve Bank that we have today. Now, there were bank charters before the Federal Reserve in America. There was like a 20-year charter and I think another like 10-year charter. And they were both, those charters were not renewed and for various reasons. And really the main reason was they were, the charters were run by private bankers and with their own self-interests of course, extracting as much wealth and resources as they possibly could from the American people, right? We're in the same predicament today, only that we're no longer in a charter bank situation, but they actually passed an act of government to make the Federal Reserve Bank, or this charter private bank, a permanent fixture, right? Even though it's not a branch of the government. It's a completely private organization that is somehow partnered with the United States government in issuing the currency. So Abraham Lincoln was one of the many presidents before and after the Civil War which opposed a private central banking system in the United States. And he paid for this opposition with his life. Here's a great quote from Abraham Lincoln. I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is my greatest foe. In 1913, after many attempts to control the U.S. banking system, the globalist bankers finally succeeded with the Federal Reserve Act. This served to permanently privatize the bank in the name of economic stability. Now, fast forward over 100 years later, and the U.S. government is barely keeping up with the interest payments to the private banks. By the year 2025, it is estimated that interest payments on the national debt will eclipse the military budget. I just want to show you what this U.S. debt clock, if you've never seen this, this is very interesting. This U.S. debt clock is basically showing us, if you look in the upper left, you see the U.S. national debt. That's a number that, I mean, it's just preposterous. I can't even imagine like what that number actually means. But it's almost $23.5 trillion in debt that the U.S. government owes this private bank that we somehow aren't allowed to know who the members are, which is very, very strange. There's a lot of statistics, a lot of different ratios happening, I should say. Ratios, and everything you see in the red obviously is a debt, and everything you see in the green is a credit. So this debt clock here. I don't know. This has been up for quite a while, but it's got all kinds of interesting stats. You can see there's gold and silver to paper ratios here on the right, auto sales, energy output, home sales, precious metals. There's all kinds of interesting goodies here. And the point of this is obviously not a conspiracy channel that's, that we're talking about, let's end the Fed. And I mean, that's a good idea anyway. But the whole point of this presentation is to show what can happen when you outsource your self-interest to others. In this case, what has happened to the U.S. government when it outsourced its financial system, its monetary policy to a private organization, right? We're going to see what's going to happen with that. And what we'll see happening with that is essentially something that benefits the private banks and hurts everyone else, because, of course, the government has, we've all agreed, at least the government in 1913 agreed to outsource their financial, their fiscal policy or finance their monetary policy in the hands of a private group of bankers. So we'll see how that turns out. We'll see who feels the pain of that. I can tell you for sure it won't be the private banks that feel the pain, right? At the exact same time that friends of the globalist bankers were hard at work reforming the American education system, okay, so at the very same time that the bankers were, the friends of these globalist bankers and the bankers that got in the Federal Reserve Act, at this very same time, their friends were helping to reform the American education system. Isn't that nice of them? This would ensure that the global elite would be provided a steady supply of undereducated, obedient workers. Before the public education system as we know it in America was formed, you had a lot of one-room schoolhouse type of setups, right? And there was a lot of advantages to the one-room schoolhouse because you had a lot of age groups. You had a lot of different, age groups and classes in the same schoolhouse. But effectively, what was happening in the one-room schoolhouse is the upperclassmen were teaching the younger kids. The middle kids were teaching the younger kids, right? And the upperclassmen were teaching the middle kids. And actually, the seniors in the one-room schoolhouse were actually teaching lessons before they even graduated. They were teaching lessons, so they were learning grammar, logic, and rhetoric, right? They were learning how to teach, and teaching helps you learn better, right? It helps you learn more better. So teaching the students how to teach others, there was a lot of skills that were lost once that model kind of went away, and they brought in place the public education system where they divide students by class, right? Then they're able to segment, then they're able to control things, right? Here's a quote from one of the biggest benefactors of the public education system is John D. Rockefeller. This is a quote from Frederick T. Gates. He was a business advisor and friend of John D. Rockefeller's. He said, then this is what he wrote to Rockefeller. He said, "In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. Now, what he's saying there, the rural folk, this is when, this was during the Industrial Revolution in America in the early 1900s, where a lot of rural folk were moving to cities for jobs. There was factories. You could go to work for Ford, or you could go to work for GM, or there's all of these factories and all of that stuff was happening, and folks were leaving and so they were trying to populate these factories around the country, around some of these big cities, with obedient workers, right? I'll keep reading this quote here. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply, right? So this kind of tells you, at least for me, this kind of shows me another example of outsourcing your self-interest, right? Because, okay, you get public education, and it's free. And by the way, every morning we say the Pledge of Allegiance, which is basically, you should just say it what it is. It's basically, it's a word, and now a word from our sponsor, right? Because this free education is made possible by the U.S. government. But at the same time, you have an army of 7-year-olds pledging allegiance to a flag, to a country. They're 7 years old. They don't know what they're pledging allegiance to. They don't even know what it means, right? I don't think it was ever explained to me when I was a student what I was pledging allegiance to, exactly why. It always seemed kind of strange. But this outsourcing of our self-interest happened in America over 100 years ago, right? For education and for our monetary system. These are the two, as far as I'm concerned, these are the two main drivers of our country, right? And we lost them 100 years ago, right? So nowadays, you need to be especially careful in the area of finances and education, right? I don't use the term word sorcery very often, but there's a lot going on in these areas where youth are easily preyed upon in this way, right? Finances are not often taught in school, right? At least I never learned finances in high school or college, although debt is certainly a hard lesson learned after graduation. As both a college graduate and later on a college dropout myself, I would certainly recommend going if that is what you want, but I wouldn't recommend it as a safe way to discover what you want to do, kind of, sort of, or just having this fear of, if I don't do this, I'm going to flip burgers type of decision, right? I don't think that's a wise choice at all. If you know 100% you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, an architect, a teacher, etc., then go to college. You need to go to college, right? If you don't know what you want yet, real world experience, finding that out, is far more valuable these days than is having a college degree with little to no work experience. Don't waste 4 years not knowing what you want to do and end up getting, I'm just going to do an English Lit degree or political science or psychology is interesting, I'll just take that. Don't do that. Don't throw away 4 years of having real life world experience. And you could, in those 4 years, you could you could figure out, hey, I really like to do this or that. And after 4 years of experience in any field, right? And just because you don't have a college degree doesn't mean you're not capable of learning. You're not going to be an asset after you gain some experience. A lot of employers nowadays would hire someone with 4 years of solid experience, solid job experience, over someone with just a bachelor's degree, for example, or even a master's degree, right? Doesn't really mean as much as it used to, because so many people have bachelor's degrees now. It's so common. And so if you want to be that unicorn, you want to have 4 years of really solid experience, right? Now, guaranteed government loans drive the cost of college even higher, because universities have been counting on this steady income year after year, right? If more people stop going to college, the price goes down. Simple supply and demand, really. The whole college loan thing actually started after the Russians launched their Sputnik satellite, and it really shocked America. They were the first to make it into space with their very simple satellite. And the United States and the president accelerated a program to make college accessible for the sciences. If you wanted to go to college and you wanted to work in aeronautics, or you wanted to be an engineer, right? If you wanted to work in pretty much any of the sciences, you could get a college loan. You could get a guaranteed loan as long as you were in a certain field. And then eventually, after 10, 15, 20 years, that changed to basically everyone. So they made it so everyone could get a guaranteed college loan. Everyone, right? If you can fog a mirror, you can get a college loan. But a lot of people went to college for the wrong reasons. It's like, well, I can for sure go to college, but then you're saddled with all of this debt. Well, you're right. But that's kind of part of that might just be an unintended consequence or unintended bonus, whichever way you see it, right? So, and now they're talking about, of course, forgiving all of the debt. So now there's even more people enrolling in college, thinking, well, at the end of this, I probably won't have to pay it anyway, so I'll get a free ride, kind of thing. I mean, that's kind of a gamble. But the point is, the cost of education has just been going up and up and up and up and up, right? Books and just resources and housing and everything's, this professor salaries, everything's going up, 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 right? But what happens if attendance goes down? They have to bring the price down too, right? So it costs a lot more today, even if you just adjust for wages, than it did maybe even 50 years ago, right? Which is kind of preposterous, because so many people have college degrees. They're not worth as much as they used to be because they're not as special, and yet the costs keep going up and up and up, right? So something's going on here, and what's causing that is the guaranteed loans, because the colleges know they know for sure they're going to have a steady stream of students year in and year out, right? But what if that doesn't happen 1 year, right? And then and then the second year they have less students. You'll see tuition costs go down. So how do people end up getting tricked in the first place, right? Psychology plays a big part, of course, and none other than Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, quite literally wrote the book entitled Propaganda, which is a modern-day sorcerer's handbook on how to convince large groups of people to accept things using psychological manipulation in the name of advertising, right? So we're taking kind of a left turn here. Now we're going into the area of advertising a little bit. But really, considered with Bernays here, he's considered the father of public relations. And he set the standard, which is used by marketing and advertising agencies today. What Bernays understood was the manipulation of human emotions blended with a moderate amount of word magic embedded in various PR campaigns, right? He was the guy that famously made it okay for women to smoke in public. Apparently, it was taboo just after the turn of the century to smoke in public. And he got a hold of some members of the press in New York City and said, we want you to come down to Times Square. There's going to be women lighting torches of freedom. They called the cigarettes torches of freedom. That's how he described it. So that if you were opposed to women smoking, well then, are you opposed to women lighting their torches of freedom? Are you opposed to women's rights and women's freedom? Well, how could you, Of course, any kind of smoking is not good for you, obviously. It's kind of, it doesn't make any sense. Women didn't have as much rights as they do now, of course. So it was a totally different time. But the point is, it's this language that is used, right? It's this language that Bernays used. He crafted specific language to frame things in a way that if you were opposed to something or you said no, then you were saying no to something even higher than the actual issue, right? If you were saying something like, well, I'm opposed to women smoking in public, say you're living in the 1910s, women shouldn't be smoking in public, but then he turns it around and says, but you are against women lighting their torches of freedom. You're against freedom, right? So takes that next logical leap. And that's all done with word magic, right? Or word sorcery. So let's get back to this outsourcing of your self-interest, because, Bernays, at the end of the day, he was looking for creative ways to get people to outsource their self-interest or give up their own discernment, right? And how to manipulate that away from people, right? So at the end of the day, though, we are ultimately acting in our own self-interest, first and foremost, right? Everyone is. So think about that. Every person is. You, your teacher, your boss, the president, the generals of the army, like everyone's really working in their own self-interest. Now you have to understand you have responsibilities to certain people, right? But at the end of the day, you feel the most impact from your decision-making. Your decision-making is primarily tied to your own self-interest, right? Even a volunteer gets a good feeling from helping others in need, right? So to each their own rewards. It is simultaneously in our individual and collective self-interest to be kind to each other, right? To treat each other fairly, and so on. This is an implicitly understood expectation that most of us share. We know it's a very low level of existence if someone's operating in this realm of their own self-interest and to the exclusion of all others around them, right? That's obviously not a long-term recipe for success, right? So our health and happiness as individuals depends mostly upon our choices, as well as fair treatment from others. However, the fact is sometimes our self-interests do not align with others, right? What do we do then? Let's say you need to buy a car. A used car salesman wants you to finance a car that is well out of your budget, right? Your self-interests are in conflict because you can't afford that, right? You know that would put you in a bad position. And perhaps you feel negotiating will get you nowhere, right? So you can leave and you can look for another car salesperson, right, that may be more reasonable. But what happens if you can't go anywhere else? What happens if you have no choice, right? The used car salesman doesn't care about loading you up with debt and the negative consequences that will affect your life. He doesn't have to live with those consequences. Only you do, right? The same can be said about regulations, policies, and laws which directly affect your life. You've probably never met anyone who is involved in the private Federal Reserve banking system, right? And yet their decisions affect our lives every day. You are responsible for the consequences of your actions, but somehow, some way, you must endure the consequences of what government or what private banks decide is best for you. Somehow you must endure those, right? Government is comprised of individuals at the end of the day, pursuing their own individual self-interests and the self-interests of their constituents, which elect them, right? Which set of self-interests do politicians most intimately feel the effects of? Your self-interest or their own, right? When politicians get it wrong, the voters are quick to blame them. In this way, blame represents a psychological pattern of denial when things go wrong, as they always do in the public sphere. Why? Because the collective self-interests of the many, right? Let me say that again. The collective self-interest of the many will never filter down to fully satisfy your own personal self-interests. So anyone working in a large, working in like government or a large company or what have you, there's some sort of goal. Like if you're working for the post office, the overall goal is to get the mail delivered on time, right? But then inside of this giant monolithic goal of getting the mail delivered on time, you have all these people pursuing their own self-interests, right? And so you have to understand that in these giant monoliths called government, called banks, called the postal service, called Amazon, whatever, you have all of these individuals pursuing their own self-interests, right? And that would explain perfectly why things on a large scale start to just become a giant ball of crap and really don't work that well, right? It's because the person if you call into support and maybe, you have an issue with something, this or that, you're not going to get, you call Amazon, you're not going to talk to Jeff Bezos, right? You're going to talk to someone whose their self-interest is not in Jeff Bezos' self-interest. So they're not going to treat you like Jeff Bezos would if he were answering the phone because it's his company, right? So some things are worth taking time to learn about for yourself, okay? Now, in terms of outsourcing your self-interest, in certain ways we have little to no control over, right? Or so you think. There's many alternatives out there, such as money. There are many states, especially out in the Western states, that have their own gold-backed currencies, for example, that you can buy into. There's in the state of Utah, for example, you can buy a gold note. It's an association. It's not a state. The states cannot coin money, of course, but the individual organizations can, and they're already starting to do this, and they've passed laws in the past 5 or 10 years. They've been passing laws in Western states that private organizations can make their own sound currency. They can issue their own sound currency based on gold, based on silver, for example. So that's actually happening, believe it or not. That's actually happening, and I think that's a great hedge. If the Fed and the dollar were to completely collapse, at least some of the Western states would have some kind of system. People would have some kind of medium of exchange, right? That was actually based on sound money, right? But really, that's one example. But you should never, you don't want to, that's kind of a way out there kind of thing for most people. But when it comes to your own mind and body, right, your health, what you're taking into your body, you don't want to outsource your self-interest, right? It doesn't mean you have to like be, you just have to, you don't have to just forsake all of your, favorite junk crap foods that you enjoy and just, eat salads the rest of your life and that's it, right? Don't think in that extreme, but you have to find, you at least have to root out the foods that are really, really, really bad for you, right? So this is the end of part 14. And in an upcoming part, I'll talk a little bit more about just briefly diet, nutrition, and health. But the point is, especially in a future episode, I want to talk about something that is highly overlooked and is a huge, huge epidemic problem. And people in the future, a century from now, are going to look at this time right now in history. They're going to look at the year 2020. In 2120, they're going to look back and go, we cannot believe they used to sell that to children. That's crazy. So that's a little cliffhanger for you, a little cliffhanger. Okay, I will see you guys next week.